There is no sound when the end begins. Only the quiet hum of planetary defenses turning inward, the faint thrum of void shields about to fail, and the deep, bone-shaking pulse of orbital bombardment warming to its final cadence. From orbit, Exterminatus is beautiful, if beauty can be found in annihilation. The world below glows like a dying ember in the night, its oceans boiling, its continents consumed by light older than mercy. The Imperium calls it purification, but to those who live through its first seconds, it is damnation made manifest. For the billions upon the planet's surface, there is no time for prayer, no time for understanding. There is only the final truth that the Emperor's mercy burns brighter than any star. If you wish to witness the final heartbeat of a world, if you want to see what faith and fire mean in the Imperium of man, then stand your ground with us. Subscribe, share, and stay till the last moment. For this is not merely the story of death. It is the story of what refuses to die. The first sign was not the light, but the silence. For weeks, the city of Ardentis had trembled under rumors. Rebellion in the lower hives, contagion in the water reserves, whispers of heresy spreading faster than any cure. Yet none of that prepared them for the quiet. The sky had always been a living thing on this world, a haze of smog and industrial discharge, the unending roar of manufactoria that forged weapons for a war no one ever saw. But that morning the forges stilled. The great Vox towers fell mute. Even the constant hum of the air recyclers faded into absence, and the people looked up, startled, like animals that had just realized the forest had gone silent. Illyra stood at the edge of the hab balcony, her hands gripping the corroded railing until rust flaked beneath her fingers. She had grown up beneath that sky, had watched it shift from the dull red of dawn to the ashen gray of evening, and never once had it looked like this. The clouds hung motionless, heavy and low, as though waiting for something vast to breathe beneath them. Her son tugged at her sleeve, asking why the sirens hadn't sounded. She had no answer. When the first streak of light appeared, it was beautiful, a thin, perfect line, carving downward through the clouds like a finger of glass. People leaned from windows to watch, murmuring to one another. Children laughed, believing it to be some celestial parade, a comet blessed by the Emperor. The local priest stepped into the street, arms raised, his voice trembling with awe. "The Emperor provides," he said, though the words broke against his teeth. Moments later, the sky began to burn. The first torpedo's entry shattered the clouds into fire. A wave of light rolled outward, turning the upper atmosphere into a mirror of molten gold. The manufactoria towers melted where they stood, raining down in rivers of metal. Those close enough to see the descent with their own eyes were blinded instantly. Those farther away heard only the wind shift, a single colossal intake of breath before the world began to scream. Illyra pulled her son close and ran, her boots sliding across the trembling ferrocrete. The sound of the detonation reached them not as a thunderclap but as pressure, a physical weight that pressed against their chests until breathing became impossible. The hab blocks buckled, their walls imploding inward as shock waves rippled through the foundations. The air filled with ash and the taste of burning copper. Somewhere in the distance, the planetary defense batteries opened fire, not on the descending torpedoes, but on their own power grid. It was the last act of obedience to an order that could not be disobeyed. Exterminatus had been decreed. Every living soul on Ardentis was now condemned by the same hand that had once sworn to protect them. Illyra stumbled into a maintenance corridor, clutching her son so tightly he could barely breathe. Around her, others gathered in the dark. Workers, soldiers, priests stripped of certainty. A man in the livery of the Astra Militarum pressed his back against the wall, his laser gun trembling in his grip. "It's the Navy," he muttered. "The Emperor's will. We've been marked." An old woman laughed, the sound broken, hysterical. "We must have sinned greatly," she said, "to earn mercy and fire." The ceiling above them groaned, shedding flakes of burning paint. The world outside had turned red, not from flame alone, but from the atmosphere itself igniting. Lightning crawled through the sky, silent and furious, feeding on the planet's breath. The soldiers began to pray, their voices low and rhythmic. Illyra could not pray. The words would not come. She thought of her husband, gone to the upper levels months before to repair the orbital relays, and wondered if he had seen the light from above. Was he still alive? Did he know that the fire was not an attack to repel, but a judgment to obey? She wanted to believe that he did not. The tremor that followed was deeper than sound. The ground itself flexed, shifting like muscle beneath their feet. Somewhere far above, one of the hive spires collapsed. Its fall a roar that lasted minutes, a tower's death echoing across the continent. The maintenance corridor shuddered, its lights flickering to black. When they came back on, the soldier was gone. Only his laser gun remained, its metal still warm. The boy beside her asked if the Emperor was angry. Illyra could not bring herself to lie. "No," she whispered, though her voice cracked. "He's just tired." A moment later, the second wave hit. This time there was no light. Only sound, a sound so immense it became silence again. The world tilted, and Illyra's last clear thought before the ceiling fell was that the sky had changed color once more. No longer gold, no longer red, only black, infinite and waiting. And somewhere far above, in the command bridge of an orbiting cruiser, an inquisitor watched the planet through a hololithic display. The surface boiled in slow-motion silence, the cities reduced to embers beneath a sea of Promethean storms. His face was calm, his hand steady as he uttered the rite of cleansing. "In his name," he said, and pressed the final rune. The fire descended anew. Dust became the air they breathed. It coated the tongue like ash from a funeral pyre and turned every swallow into a scrape. Illyra woke beneath a slant of collapsed ceiling, her ears ringing and her thoughts scattered into fragments that would not fit together. For a moment she did not remember the word for light. Then her son moved against her side and memory returned all at once. The falling towers, the pressure that crushed prayer into silence, the sky that had turned to black. She pulled him free of the debris and found her hands bleeding, the blood already drying into rust on her knuckles. Around them, the maintenance corridor had become a trench. Pipes had ruptured overhead, weeping steam that tasted of metal and old water. A Vox grill crackled with intermittent static, coughing half-words from some distant command node that no longer existed. The tremors came like slow, cold heartbeats through the floor, each one a reminder that the planet was being unmade from the crust inward. People stirred in the gloom, faces gray with dust, eyes wide and unfocused like the eyes of those who had stared too long at miracles. Illyra checked her son's ribs with trembling fingers and felt only bruises. When she tried to stand, the corridor swayed. She steadied herself against a wall sign smeared with soot, its letters warning of Prometheum lines and live conduits, as if such warnings still mattered. The priest who had laughed before lay nearby, his lips moving soundlessly, his rosary tangled in a broken cable. At the far end of the corridor, light glowed, not from a lumen strip but from outside. A dull red smear that pulsed as if the world had become a furnace door left ajar. She moved toward it because there was nowhere else to go. The survivors followed, shuffling in a slow procession that felt like a pilgrimage without destination. A battered trooper of the Astra Militarum emerged from the dust and fell into step beside her. One lens of his visor shattered, his laser gun slung but forgotten. He nodded once, a soldier's greeting that needed no rank. "Sergeant Vardis," he said, as if a name could anchor anything. "If the lifts still run, they'll go down." "Not up." "Down to where?" she asked. "Rockcrete vaults." "Flood tunnels." "Any hole with thick walls?" He glanced at the child clinging to her sleeve. "If there's a way to slow the heat, it'll be below." The corridor opened into a service junction torn wide by the shock waves. Beyond it, a vertical shaft yawned, its maintenance ladders stripped of safety cages, its depths breathing warm air that smelled of chemicals and buried engines. Somewhere below, something burned with a steady, hungry sound. Vardis leaned out, peered downward, and drew back quickly as a tongue of heated wind licked his faceplate. "It's already in the vents," he said. "Move fast." They descended in a chain of hands and raw palms, boots scraping, metal whining under weight. The red light above faded to brown, then to an ugly gray that made skin appear sickened. Illyra counted the rungs for her son until the numbers lost meaning and became rhythm. Her throat ached, the child's breath hitched and whistled, and each sound carved a new line of fear in her chest. At the base of the shaft, they found a chamber with 3 doors. 2 were jammed by warped frames. The third side opened to reveal a tunnel lined with thick cables, its floor half flooded with black water that steamed against their legs. Somewhere in the dark, an engine stuttered to life and died again like a creature trying to remember how to breathe. The tunnel led toward the old recycling manufactorum, where Illyra had once counted shift chimes by the boiler whistle. She knew a side office there with a lock that had never worked. Walls, a door, a pause. They pushed onward. The manufactorum had been stripped of shape. Machines lay toppled like slain beasts. Stacks of stamped components melted into black rivers that had cooled into rippled iron. The Imperial Aquila above the overseer's door hung scorched and crooked. One wing surrendered to heat. The air carried the bitter sweetness of burned plastic and the faint animal smell of cooked protein. Elira shoved the office door with her shoulder and it gave, hinges shrieking. Inside, grime-dulled pick screens stared with dead glass eyes, and a data slate lay cracked beneath a film of gray dust. She shepherded her son under the desk, the priest and 2 other workers crowding in after them, while Vardis took the doorway and watched the tunnel like a man expecting orders that would never arrive. The first aftershock hit with a sideways lurch that lifted the floor and set the walls to groan. The desk shifted. The ceiling shed fine powder like gray rain. Vardis braced himself and rode the motion out. Orbital patterns gone to saturation, he muttered, more to the air than to them. They're not targeting anymore, they're washing. Elira stared at the cracked pick screen and saw only her own face painted in ash. The child's reflection folded into hers. She remembered the stories told to hive children about the Emperor's light guiding ships through the nightmare between stars, about the Astronomican burning in the void like a promise. She wondered if that light could see them now, if any beam of meaning could pierce a sky turned to molten glass. The priest found his voice at last, rough and low. If we endure, it will be by his will. If we die, it will be by his will. Either way, his will is done. Vardis did not turn. With respect, holy man, his will could have used better timing. Another tremor, longer, a dragging roar that seemed to come from the bones of the world. Heat bloomed through the walls. The water on the floor steamed harder, then burst into frantic bubbles that popped against Elira's boots. The child pressed his face into her stomach and said nothing, which frightened her more than screaming. She reached for words that could hold him together and found only the truth that would not break in her mouth. I'm here. The Vox grill above the door spat a single phrase through a veil of static. It was not an order. It was not a prayer. It was a line of code from a voice that had chosen not to be human. By writ of inquisitorial authority, cleansing is enacted. The speaker clicked off as if embarrassed at what it had confessed. Something changed in Vardis at that. The set of his shoulders hardened, not in anger but in decision. He turned from the door and knelt to Elira's eyeline, his visor reflecting the dim shape of the child's face. There's a secondary sump 2 corridors over, maybe thicker walls, maybe a manual gate. If the pressure knocks these tunnels, the flow will take the path of least resistance. We need a place that lets us choose the path. Elira nodded because refusing was another kind of death. The priest clutched his rosary until the beads cut his skin, leaving neat circles of blood that looked like a script written by a careful hand. They moved again, each step a theft from the mathematics of heat and time. In the sump corridor, the heat hit like the breath of a forge. Far down the tunnel, a rectangle of darkness suggested the gate Vardis wanted. Between them and it lay a slick of boiling water and twisted cable that snapped and spat like angry serpents. Vardis slung his laser gun forward, fired 3 precise shots into a beam joint above, and sent a curtain of scrap sheeting crashing down to make a temporary bridge. Steam surged up around it, screaming against the cold metal. They crossed in a stumbling line, Vardis last, the water licking at his greaves. The gate wheel resisted their hands at first, then turned with a groan that sounded almost relieved. The slab rolled into place. The air settled by a degree that felt like mercy. For a long moment no one spoke. The child's breathing slowed. The priest's lips moved in a quieter litany that asked nothing and promised less. Elira let her head rest against the cool iron of the gate and tasted salt that might have been sweat or tears. A distant thunder rolled through the stone and another closer, as if the planet were learning the rhythm of its own dying. Vardis sat with his back to the wall, laser gun across his knees. Visor turned toward the ceiling as if staring through it at the burning sky. Orders used to make sense, he said softly. You followed them because they saved someone. Now you follow them so the numbers add up in a place you'll never see. Elira closed her eyes and saw the first torpedo again, that beautiful line of glass cutting the cloud. She wondered who had watched it from above with steady hands and a heart armored against planets. She wondered if mercy could look like this and still be called mercy. The gate shivered once as if something vast had pressed a palm against it from the far side. The iron held. The heat held. The world beyond the thickness of that door scratched and groaned and boiled. and inside the sump they breathed in time with one another like a single animal teaching itself how to live in fire. The sump chamber stank of scorched metal and old oil, a stench that crawled into the lungs and lingered there like smoke. For hours or days, time had lost its shape. Illyra and the few survivors remained within that iron cocoon, listening to the planet's death throes through the walls. The sound came in waves, deep rolling impacts from orbit, the rattle of collapsing tunnels, the shriek of steel stressed past memory. Every noise carried the same meaning. The Emperor's judgment had not ended. It was still descending, patient, methodical, unstoppable. Sergeant Vardis paced the perimeter, his boots leaving prints in the soot that coated the floor. He had stripped the outer layers of his flak armor, revealing a patchwork of burn marks and old scars. The emblem of the Astra Militarum on his shoulder had half melted, its wings fused into a shape that looked almost like a wound. Every few minutes he adjusted the dials of his auspex, though no signal had broken the static in hours. The device hissed and crackled with the same empty noise as the vox grills that once carried orders from the stars. Illyra sat with her son in her lap, feeling the tremors of his shallow sleep. His breathing was uneven but alive. That, she told herself, was still victory. The priest had died quietly an hour before. Heart, heat, faith, who could tell the difference now? His rosary had melted into his fingers, the beads fusing into a single black thread. Illyra pried it loose and held it tight, though she no longer knew the prayers it represented. Vardis spoke without looking at her. "There's a saying among soldiers," he murmured. "Faith weighs more than armor, but at least armor can break." She looked up at him. "Do you still believe?" He laughed under his breath, a sound like gravel. "I believe the shells will keep falling until the Admiral's data slate says they've burned us all to glass. Beyond that, I don't think belief changes much." The boy stirred. "Why are they doing it?" His voice was small, cracked by thirst. Neither answered. What truth could be spoken to a child in a world that had already been condemned? That it was for purity? For duty? For fear? That the Emperor demanded it? None of those words would fit inside a heart so small and uncorrupted, so Illyra only brushed dust from his hair and whispered, "Because sometimes we forget how to stop." The walls moaned again, deeper this time. Vardis raised his head. "Pressure shift," he said. "Outer structures are failing. If the ground seal ruptures, this whole section could implode. Where would we go? Doesn't matter. Anywhere is temporary now." The iron gate shuddered once, hard enough to send ripples through the standing water. For an instant, a shaft of red light appeared between its seams, a warning glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Vardis crossed the chamber and laid his hand against the metal. It vibrated faintly, not with impact but with sound, something rhythmic, almost mechanical, echoing from beyond. "That's not bombardment," he said. "That's movement." He listened closer and the noise grew clearer. Not explosions, but voices. The language was too broken to understand, filtered through layers of interference, but it rose and fell like chanting. It came from below, faint but undeniable. Illyra's skin prickled. Who would still be alive down there? Vardis adjusted his auspex again. Not alive. Not exactly. Before she could ask, the gate released a breath of scalding air and the red glow faded. The sound drifted away into the depths. The silence that followed was somehow worse. When they finally left the chamber, the world beyond had changed again. The tunnels were unrecognizable, walls warped into strange patterns by heat, floors cracked into jagged veins that glowed faintly with residual energy. The air was a colorless haze that shimmered like oil. Vardis led them through the maze by instinct, following the downward slope. He claimed the lower levels would offer more shielding from orbital fire, but Illyra suspected he simply needed to keep moving. To stop was to admit that nowhere was safe. They passed through what had once been a storage concourse. Crates lay burst open, their contents melted into indistinct masses. A servitor hung suspended from the ceiling by its own torn cables, its face frozen in the flicker of residual life. When they walked beneath it, its vox grill crackled. A single word, stretched and distorted, leaked through: "Repent." The boy began to cry silently, shaking against his mother's chest. Illyra held him tighter, whispering his name until the sound steadied. They found food of a sort, emergency rations fused together by heat, edible only after scraping away the outer crust. The water in the pipes was warm, metallic. Every swallow tasted of promethium, yet even that was sustenance. They were still alive, which felt like defiance. Hours later, the tunnel widened into a cavernous chamber, a place half natural, half carved by forgotten machinery. Stalactites of slag dripped from the ceiling, glowing at their tips like dying coals. In the center stood a pillar of metal that pulsed faintly with internal light. Vardis approached it and wiped soot from a panel, revealing a half-melted sigil of the Mechanicus. "It's an old core conduit," he said. "Feeds power to the orbital uplinks." Or it did. Elira stared at the slow pulse of light inside the pillar. It looked alive, like something struggling to breathe. "Is it still working?" "Working?" Vardis touched the surface. It was warm, almost feverish. "No. Dreaming, maybe." They stayed near the conduit that night, its dull rhythm a mockery of a heartbeat. Above them, through kilometers of stone and ruin, the orbital bombardment continued in silence. The planet's crust had begun to fracture. Seismic tremors rippled through the bedrock like the steps of an approaching god. Every pulse of the conduit seemed to echo those tremors, growing fainter with each one. When Elira finally slept, she dreamed of the sky. Not the burning one she had seen, but a sky of black glass reflecting fire beneath its surface. Something enormous moved within it, slow and sorrowful, as if mourning what it was forced to destroy. She reached for it, whispering the only prayer she remembered. The sky whispered back. She woke to Vardis shaking her shoulder, his visor cracked anew, his voice hoarse. "Get up, the ground's moving." And for the first time, she felt it not as an explosion but as a heartbeat, a steady, impossible rhythm rising from the planet itself. The floor beneath them trembled with that steady pulse, deep and resonant like the echo of something vast awakening far below. It was not the violence of bombardment, nor the collapsing of rock or metal. It was measured, deliberate, impossibly alive. The survivors pressed closer to the glowing conduit, drawn to its faint warmth as though it offered understanding. The air vibrated faintly with the rhythm, a low thrum that seemed to bypass hearing and settle directly in the bones. Vardis crouched beside the pillar, his hand pressed against its trembling surface. "It's a machine," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Or what's left of one. But something's feeding it. The orbital grid should have cut power hours ago. This isn't..." He stopped listening. The hum grew louder, forming layers, harmonics almost like voices. Not words, not yet, but the ghost of articulation. Elira's son pointed toward the conduit, his small finger trembling. "It's talking," he whispered. Vardis looked sharply at him, then back at the pillar. "No, it's just..." Before he could finish, the hum shifted again, splitting into two distinct tones, one low, one high. They oscillated in a pattern too deliberate to be random. Vardis's auspex clicked weakly in response, its cracked screen stuttering with lines of ancient data script. "It's transmitting," he said. "Emperor preserve us, it's transmitting." "To who?" Elira asked. He didn't answer. The auspex flared briefly, then died with a hiss of smoke. The pillar's light dimmed and brightened again in slow rhythm, casting long, molten shadows against the chamber walls. The priest's melted rosary beads, still clutched in Elira's hand, began to vibrate faintly. She let them fall, horrified as the hum grew into a recognizable pattern, syllables broken by static. "Faith remains." The voice came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through the very air they breathed. It was not human, but neither was it alien. It was a composite of countless echoes, as if the world itself were remembering its own prayers. The survivors dropped to their knees without meaning to, instinct overriding reason. "Faith remains," the voice repeated, stronger now. "All will burn. All will endure." Vardis took a step back, his face pale behind his visor. "That's no signal. That's a broadcast through the crust itself. Something's using the planet as a conduit." Elira looked around at the glowing veins that lined the chamber walls, faint lines of molten gold spreading outward like a circulatory system. "The throne's light," she whispered. "It's bleeding through the rock." He shook his head. "No, this isn't the Emperor. It's something else. Maybe a relay from orbit. Maybe a psychic feedback from the bombardment. But it's not him." The words felt blasphemous, but she didn't argue. The pillar pulsed again, faster now, its glow rising to a feverish brightness. From deep within the tunnels came new sounds. Footsteps, dozens of them, synchronized, metallic. The air filled with the smell of oil and sanctified incense. Vardis raised his laser gun and motioned for the others to move behind the conduit. Stay low. Don't speak. The footsteps grew nearer until their source emerged from the tunnel's mouth. A column of figures, their silhouettes illuminated by the red glow of emergency lumens. Skitarii. Their bionic limbs gleamed with soot and heat damage, their sensor arrays flickering erratically. They moved like men half remembering how to walk. At their head came a taller shape, a tech priest Dominus, robes scorched, mechadendrites twitching like nervous serpents. Vardis stepped forward cautiously. Dominus! Praise the Omnissiah. You made it out of the forge sectors. The figure halted, turning its head with a slow, mechanical grace. Its faceplate had melted partially, one optic lens glowing a dull orange. When it spoke, the voice was both machine and ghost, filtered through layers of static. The machine endures. Flesh fails. The creed is tested. Vardis lowered his weapon slightly. We're survivors from upper hive sectors. There's a child. Civilians. We need to reach the deeper tunnels, any path that leads beneath the bombardment zone. The Dominus regarded him for a moment, the servos in its neck whining softly. Beneath, it said. There is no beneath. Only the core. Only the judgment. From the Skitarii ranks came a hiss of binary code, sharp and discordant. The Dominus extended a mechadendrite toward the glowing conduit. This world's heart sings the Emperor's hymn in corrupted tone. It must be silenced, Vardis frowned. You'll destroy it? It is already dying, the Dominus said. We will ease its passage. Elira stepped forward before Vardis could stop her. It spoke, she said. It said faith remains. That everything will burn and endure. Isn't that what your creed teaches? Endurance through destruction? The Dominus turned toward her, his optics flickering. Faith is an algorithm. When corrupted, it loops unto madness. You hear meaning because you are weak. Vardis's voice was cold. You'll kill us all if you trigger a power collapse in this section. Death is function, the Dominus replied. Entropy is purity. The mechadendrites lashed forward, piercing the pillar's outer casing. The glow surged violently, casting the chamber in blinding light. The hum became a scream, not of pain but of release. The floor cracked beneath their feet, molten fissures spiderwebbing outward. The Dominus convulsed, sparks exploding from his frame as the energy coursed through him. Vardis grabbed Elira's arm. Run! They fled into the tunnels as the chamber erupted behind them. The light pursued them like a flood, chasing through the cracks and corridors, turning every shadow into gold. When it finally receded, the sound that remained was not silence. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, impossibly vast. The survivors collapsed in a side passage, the air thick with ash. Vardis removed his shattered visor, his eyes bloodshot but alive. That wasn't the Mechanicus, he said. Not anymore. Whatever was left of them is gone. Elira cradled her son against her chest. The child looked up at her, his pupils reflecting the faint golden light that still pulsed faintly through the stone. It's still talking, he whispered. Vardis listened, and for a moment he thought he heard it too, a faint, rhythmic whisper running beneath the tremors, threading through the silence. Not a machine, not an echo. Something deeper, a planet trying to remember its prayers. When the planet broke open, it did not scream. It exhaled. The bombardment had reached the mantle, and now the world itself was coming apart. Not in chaos, but in grim, deliberate order. The crust fractured like glass under heat, entire continents shifting as orbital torpedoes bored through the lithosphere to ignite the planetary core. The air had grown thin in the lower tunnels, trembling with every pulse from above. There was no sky anymore, only a dome of flame stretching horizon to horizon. Vardis led the survivors deeper through the veins of the Manufactorum catacombs. The heat had melted the walls into rivers of slag that pulsed faintly with their own light. Here, where daylight could not reach, the only illumination came from molten fissures that ran beneath the metal floor like arteries. Their glow painted the survivors in red and gold, transforming them into walking silhouettes. The tunnels had once been arteries of production, rail lines for servitors, pneumatic routes for resource shuttles. Now they were graves. Skeletons of machines lay strewn across the floors, limbs twisted, servo hands still reaching for controls that no longer existed. The smell of burned lubricant clung to everything. The child had stopped asking questions. His silence was absolute, his face smudged with soot and fear. He clutched the melted rosary that Elira had given him, turning it over and over in his small hand as though its texture might still mean salvation. Vardis walked ahead, laser gun in hand, though there was nothing left to fight but heat and memory. When they reached the lower substation, the ground trembled again. Dust rained from the ceiling and one of the tunnels behind them collapsed entirely. The noise was apocalyptic, an endless roar punctuated by metallic screams as ancient support girders surrendered to pressure. Illyra flinched but did not stop moving. The boy stumbled and Vardis scooped him up with one arm, his armor searing hot against the child's side. "Keep going," he said. "If we stop, we'll cook where we stand." They passed through a chamber filled with shattered cogitator banks. One still flickered weakly, its display rolling through fragments of forgotten orders. Across the cracked screen, a final directive repeated in endless loop. "Exterminatus protocol confirmed." "Faith through fire," Vardis spat. "Faith through fire," he muttered. "They always say that from orbit." Illyra's voice was hoarse. "You think they'll remember us?" He looked at her, eyes hollow behind the soot and the exhaustion. "We're already forgotten." The tremors intensified. A low rolling vibration traveled through the metal floor, followed by a rising pressure in the air. The heat became unbearable. Vardis's auspex, cracked and half-dead, began to shriek. "Something's coming down," he said. "Get against the wall." They pressed themselves into the shadows just as a column of light tore through the tunnel ahead. It was not fire, not in any way they understood it. It was pure energy, light that moved like liquid, carving through the stone and metal as though it were paper. The impact was silent, but its presence made every atom tremble. The molten residue of the tunnel walls flowed toward it, absorbed into its radiance until the corridor glowed with impossible brilliance. Vardis shielded his eyes. The child whispered, "It's beautiful," and it was, terrible and transcendent. The Exterminatus payloads were doing their work, but this light was not a weapon alone. It was something purer, something that looked, for one instant, like creation seen in reverse. The ground gave way beneath them. They fell into the lower sectors, tumbling through a void of flame and smoke until they hit a level of packed debris and broken conduits. Illyra gasped, her lungs seared by the heat. Above them, the tunnel they had come through was gone, replaced by a vortex of light that turned slowly in the air like a wound in reality itself. The metal around it bent inward, pulled toward that impossible center. Vardis pushed himself to his feet, his armor cracked, one gauntlet missing entirely. He reached for Illyra and hauled her upright. "We're close to the core," he said. "Maybe kilometers, maybe less. Then we're dead," she said. He met her eyes. "Not yet." The vortex pulsed again, and from its center came a voice, not a human voice, not even one born of machine. It was the same whisper they had heard before, magnified now to fill the world. "Faith remains." Vardis turned toward it, weapon raised, though there was nothing to aim at. The light coalesced, forming shapes within its glow, vague silhouettes of human figures, thousands of them, shifting like images caught between memory and flame. Their faces were featureless, their outlines unstable, but their posture was unmistakable. They were kneeling, Illyra's breath caught. They're praying. The figures moved in unison, bowing toward the survivors, their gestures fluid and mournful. And then they began to rise, slowly, like smoke lifting from embers. Their bodies dissolved into streaks of gold, merging with the vortex until the light thickened, turned opaque, and erupted outward in a wave of force that hurled Vardis and Illyra to the ground. When the light receded, the figures were gone. The tunnel was gone. The air shimmered with energy that no longer burned, only hummed. Illyra turned her head toward Vardis, her voice a whisper. "Was that the Emperor?" He looked at her for a long time, then at the child who still clutched the melted rosary. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's what's left when he stops listening." Far above, the fleet commander aboard the St. Resolute watched the hololithic projection of the planet's surface. The bombardment pattern was complete. Seismic readings confirmed core destabilization. Soon the world would crack and burn away into dust. Yet even through the ship's thick hull and sanctified airlocks, the crew began to hear something. An echo, faint but unmistakable. It was not static. It was not prayer. It was the sound of countless voices whispering one phrase in perfect unison, carried through the void like radiation. "Faith remains." And for a fleeting instant, every lumen aboard the ship dimmed. Every cogitator screen flickered with the image of a burning world that refused to die. The fleet orbiting Ardentis had been reduced to silent observers. The planet beneath them no longer looked like a world, but a wound. The crust split open, molten rivers carving patterns across its surface that glowed like the veins of some titanic creature. Entire continents had turned to fire, the atmosphere vaporized into auroras of flame. From the command deck of the Saint Resolute, Inquisitor Arctellon stood with hands clasped behind his back, watching through the observation port as the last cities disintegrated. He had seen Exterminatus before, dozens of times. "It was never like this, Admiral," he said, his voice low but firm. "Report status." "Ordinatus payload complete," the Admiral replied. His face was expressionless, his uniform soaked with sweat that gleamed in the red emergency lumens. "The mantle breach is expanding at projected rate. Within 2 hours there will be no surface left to sustain orbit." Arctellon's gaze didn't waver. The light from the dying planet reflected off his augmetic eyes, twin suns mirrored in brass. "And the transmission?" The Admiral hesitated. "Still ongoing, my lord." The Inquisitor turned. "Ongoing?" "Yes, my lord. Despite total signal collapse, the planet continues to broadcast on all Vox channels. We have isolated the pattern. It's repeating." He gestured to a hollow emitter. The air shimmered and sound filled the chamber, faint, distorted, and yet undeniably human. A single phrase whispered over and over, layered 1,000 times by echoes. "Faith remains. Faith remains. Faith remains." A silence followed that was worse than noise. The bridge crew worked in rigid rhythm, no one daring to speak. The Inquisitor studied the waveform as it rippled across the projection. "Origin? Impossible to localize, my lord. The entire planetary surface is resonating. Like a choir." Arctellon's jaw tightened. He had seen heresy in all its forms, mutation, corruption, possession. But this was different. There was no chaos taint in the signal, no warp interference, only coherence. Too perfect. He leaned closer to the hollow, listening. For a moment he thought he could hear words beneath the chant. Names, memories, fragments of prayer, all folding into one another like a tide. "Cease orbital fire," he said. The Admiral's head snapped toward him. "My lord," I said, "cease." The command echoed across the bridge, followed by the clatter of servitors halting their firing routines. The engines of destruction went quiet, leaving only the soft hum of the ship's reactors. The planet's light continued to pulse through the viewport, its rhythm steady, almost deliberate. Beneath that same dying sky, far below, Vardis, Elira, and the boy had reached the lowest cavern yet, an ancient manufactorum core, long abandoned, half-submerged in molten slag. The air was too hot to breathe. Each gasp felt like swallowing ash. The child's lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes glazed. Vardis carried him now, though his armor plates had begun to fuse at the joints. "There's nowhere left to go," he rasped. His voice was breaking from heat and exhaustion. "Every tunnel leads down, and down means fire." Elira stumbled beside him, her skin blistered from the radiance that leaked through the walls. "Then we stop here," she said. "If this is where we die, then let it be where we stand." The ground shook violently, and the molten lake at the chamber's center rippled. From its surface rose pillars of light, spiraling upward like inverted lightning. Each pulse illuminated fragments of machinery embedded in the walls. Massive cogitator banks, servitor husks, and something larger still, something buried deep beneath the molten rock. It was vast, almost organic, its surface carved with sigils too old to read. Vardis stared. "That's no machine, that's a heart." The light intensified, throbbing in sync with the tremors. A sound began to rise, low and resonant, like a cathedral organ built from stone and metal. It filled every space, pressing into the skin, the lungs, the thoughts. The child stirred in Vardis's arms, eyes rolling open to reveal pupils glowing faintly gold. "It's calling," the boy whispered. "It wants to see us." Elira knelt beside the molten lake. Her reflection wavered in the glowing surface, a face torn by fear and awe. "It's not calling us," she said. "It's remembering us." The heat swelled until they could no longer stand. Vardis sank to his knees, clutching the boy close. "If this is faith," he muttered, "then it weighs more than any god." The molten heart flared one last time, and light flooded the chamber. It poured through the cracks, through the tunnels, through the entire dying planet. Every stone, every corpse, every remnant of civilization ignited, not as fire but as radiance. It spread outward into orbit, enveloping the fleet, painting the void in gold. On the bridge of the St. Resolute, alarms wailed as the light washed through the ship's hull. Systems flickered, Auspex readings spiked beyond comprehension. The crew screamed prayers, but their words dissolved into static. Arctellon stood at the viewport, bathed in the same light that now consumed the world. For the first time in his long service, he felt something he could not name. Not fear, not faith. Something between. The Admiral shouted. It's spreading through the fleet. And then the light spoke again, clear now, resonant, impossible to deny. Faith remains. Even when faith is ash. Every screen aboard the St. Resolute went black. Every lumen flickered out. And for one silent instant before the warp storms ignited, every soul aboard saw the same image. A world reduced to cinder, yet still glowing like a candle cupped against the wind. Then the light collapsed inward, and Ardentis was gone. In its place only the void remained, dark, endless, and echoing with the faintest hum of something that refused to die. Somewhere, far from the wreckage, a lone astropath on a distant ship felt the tremor of that echo and began to weep. A light still burns, she whispered into the void. But it's not the Emperor's. And with that, the galaxy shuddered. Across the void, the death of Ardentis rippled like a thought. The Astronomican wavered for less than a heartbeat, its vast psychic light dimming as if inhaling sorrow, then steadied again. But those who served as its living conduits felt the fracture in their souls. In the choir vaults of Terra, psychers convulsed in their chains. Some screamed names no mortal had taught them. Others fell silent forever, their minds burned out not by darkness but by something too luminous to endure. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica called it resonance decay. The Inquisition called it contagion. But the navigators knew the truth. They had seen the light that bloomed in the void before Ardentis's final breath. They whispered among themselves that it was no mere reflection of the Astronomican. It was its shadow cast backward through the warp. A mirror that shone from somewhere else, somewhere new. Inquisitor Arctellon had survived. Against every probability, his ship drifted at the edge of the system, half its crew dead, its machine spirit blind with damage. The hull was scarred by radiation burns, and the Vox arrays hissed with the remnants of that impossible transmission. He sat alone in the ruined bridge, the viewport cracked but holding, watching the space where the planet had once been. Nothing remained but a debris field glowing faintly, as if the ashes of faith themselves refused to go dark. He played the recording again. The words still pulsed through the static, rhythmic, deliberate. Faith remains. Even when faith is ash, every time he heard it, something within him shifted like a mechanism resetting itself. There was no malice in the voice, no heresy he could name, only certainty deeper and older than any creed. He had sent orders to the surviving ships to hold position, but the fleet was fracturing. One captain claimed to have received a direct vox from the light itself, a voice that promised deliverance through surrender. Another had turned their guns upon themselves, broadcasting psalms until their reactors melted. Each ship was alone now, orbiting the absence where a world had been, like mourners circling an unmarked grave. Arctellon rose. The light from the viewport carved harsh lines across his face, illuminating the scars that time and duty had etched there. His hand hovered over his rosarius, the symbol of his faith, and for the first time in decades he wondered whether it still meant protection. "If this is your test," he whispered to the void, "then show me the measure of it." Far below the remains of his ship, fragments of Ardentis still burned as they fell through the system's inner orbits. One of those fragments was not stone but metal, a shard of the planet's manufactoria, still carrying within it a flicker of that impossible radiance. It drifted toward the system's dead moon, caught by gravity, and when it struck the surface, the light inside did not extinguish. It spread. From that point of impact, the rock began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until it could be seen even from orbit. Those who watched it from their damaged vessels thought it was a trick of sensor malfunction. But Arctellon knew better. The light pulsed in the same rhythm as the transmission. He ordered a lander prepared, though his surviving crew protested. "The surface is unstable," they said. "No atmosphere, no life." He smiled thinly. "All the better. There will be no distractions." The descent was silent save for the rattle of the shuttle's hull. Through the viewport, the moon's surface stretched below. Ashen plains, cratered ridges, and at the center of it all a circle of gold. The impact site looked alive, molten metal veined with light. As the lander touched down, His boots met ground that trembled faintly, as if remembering the heartbeat of the world that had birthed it. He walked alone toward the crater, his Vox Link long since dead, his shadow stretched across the glowing terrain. At the edge of the crater he stopped. The center was not a pit but a hollow sphere, and within it, suspended in midair, was a fragment of something metallic, a piece of conduit or armor, or perhaps both. It rotated slowly, and around it filaments of golden light coiled like veins. Arctellon removed his gloves. The heat that radiated from the fragment was not physical. It was something that pressed directly into thought. As he reached toward it, the light recoiled, then expanded, enveloping him. For a heartbeat, he felt himself dissolve. Body, mind, purpose, until all that remained was awareness. He was no longer standing on barren stone. He was floating within a sea of gold. Voices surrounded him. Not accusatory, not pleading, but patient. Among them he recognized his own, and within that sea a single form began to take shape. A man seated upon a throne of fire, his face hidden, his presence unbearable. "You burned them," the figure said, its voice calm, almost kind. "You called it faith." Arctellon tried to speak, but his mouth filled with light. His thoughts turned to prayers, instinctive, desperate. "I did it in your name." The figure leaned forward slightly. The light around it flickered, revealing a glimpse of what might once have been human eyes. "Then what name will you speak now?" The Inquisitor fell to his knees. The heat tore through his mind like scripture being rewritten, and when the vision broke, when the light faded, he was lying at the crater's edge, the fragment before him still glowing softly. But the words that echoed within his head were no longer the Emperor's. "Faith remains." Only this time, the voice was his own. He stared into the endless gold, and for the first time in his long service, Arctellon began to doubt whether faith had ever belonged to the living at all, or if it had always been a thing that grew strongest after death. Above him, unseen in the void, the light that had once been Ardentis continued to pulse. It was no longer a remnant. It was spreading. By the time Arctellon returned to orbit, he was no longer certain what waited behind his own eyes. The shuttle's instruments still flickered with residual light from the surface, even though its fuel cells had long since died. Every surface seemed faintly luminous, each reflection whispering back the same rhythm that pulsed in his blood. When he looked down at his gloved hands, he could see the veins beneath the skin glowing faintly, like channels carved for something not entirely human. He walked through the corpse of his ship as one walks through a cathedral after the congregation has fled. Bodies of the crew floated where gravity had failed, their faces serene, their eyes burned white. There was no rot, no stench, only stillness, the calm aftermath of a revelation too vast for flesh to bear. He touched one man's shoulder, expecting the skin to collapse, but it held unyielding, like stone warmed by sunlight. The Vox system sparked alive as he passed the command dais, not from power returning, but from will. A voice broke through the static, deep and distant. "Ardentis is gone," it said, "but its faith endures." Arctellon's hand froze over the console. "Who speaks?" "Who listens?" the voice replied. He should have felt fear, but what he felt instead was recognition, the same calm certainty that had filled him in the crater. He closed his eyes. The voice continued, threading through him like a memory. "The throne burns still, yet shadows breed where light is brightest. What you saw is no heresy. It is inheritance." "From the Emperor?" Arctellon whispered. Silence. Then, a sound like the intake of a breath that was not made by lungs. He does not need to speak for his reflection to remember. Static swallowed the rest. He sat in the half-light of the ruined bridge for a long time, the words circling his thoughts like carrion birds. Reflection. The concept gnawed at him, equal parts heresy and revelation. The Emperor was divine, yes, but what divinity did to its own reflection? If his light filled the galaxy, what became of the shadows it cast? He looked out the viewport again. The space where Ardentis had been was now a storm, a swirl of golden dust and fractured light drifting through the void. At its center pulsed a single beacon, faint yet constant, marking the rhythm of that same phrase that would not leave him: "Faith remains." He activated what was left of the ship's astropathic relays, aligning them toward Terra. But the moment he initiated the connection, his mind flooded with overlapping signals. Thousands of transmissions screamed across the warp, all carrying the same signature, reports of planets blinking out of contact. of priests hearing voices during communion rites, of relics glowing with impossible light. It was as if the death of Ardentis had lit a fuse that now crawled through the Imperium itself. He tried to shut it out, but the warp is not a thing that yields. Images flickered through his mind. A cathedral on Macraga collapsing as its statues wept molten tears. A manufactorum on Mars halting production because every servitor had begun to chant. A distant battle in Segmentum Obscurus where both sides had ceased firing to stare at the twin suns that had appeared overhead. The light was everywhere, and it was spreading faster than any fleet. Arctellon stumbled back, pressing his palms to his temples. "Emperor, guide us," he whispered. But there was no comfort in the words, only habit. He looked again at the pulsing dust outside the viewport and realized it was moving. The particles were aligning, forming strands that twisted together like threads of a vast tapestry. Shapes began to emerge, faces, hands, outlines of kneeling figures. The dead of Ardentis or their memory, assembling themselves from starlight. They were not bound by gravity, nor by death. They were the echo that had survived the fire. The ship's lumen strips flared and every pic screen lit with a single image. The Imperial Aquila, its wings of light now inverted, shadowed at their tips. A voice filled the air once more, louder now, layered by countless tones, human, mechanical, divine. "You burned a world," it said. But faith is not fuel. It endures when its worshippers are ash. It learns. Arctellon fell to one knee, not in reverence but in awe. "What are you?" "I am what remains when belief survives its purpose." He tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat as the light outside surged, washing through the ship's hull like water through sand. The structure trembled, bulkheads groaning, alarms screaming into the void. The radiance filled every corridor, every chamber, every thought, and then it was gone. When Arctellon opened his eyes, the ship was drifting silently again. The bodies were gone. The air was cold. He stumbled toward the viewport, and what he saw froze him. The storm that had been Ardentis was dispersing across the stars, but each fragment that drifted away burned with steady light, faint yet constant. The system's void was now a sea of golden embers, each one pulsing with rhythm, each one carrying the same impossible signature. He spoke the words aloud, and they no longer felt foreign. Faith remains. His reflection in the glass did not move with him. It smiled. The vox crackled once more, a single burst of static shaped into language. "Do not fear the shadow. It is his other face." And as the last light faded from the viewport, the Inquisitor understood. The Emperor had not spoken. He did not need to. His silence had found its echo, and that echo was now alive. Arctellon closed his eyes, bowed his head, and whispered the final prayer that was not a prayer at all. "If this is your shadow, then let me follow it, outside." The embers began to move, slowly at first, then in formation, drifting together into the void like a fleet of golden ghosts bound for some unseen horizon. The stars seemed dimmer in the wake of Ardentis's death. Whole sectors of void space fell silent as transmissions ceased. Astropathic relays burned out and warp routes shifted like living things recoiling from a wound. Yet in that darkness a new constellation began to appear. One no chart could predict. One made not of suns but of the drifting embers that once were fragments of a dead world. They burned with a soft, steady gold, their light pulsing in unison, as if guided by an unseen heart. The navigators whispered that the Emperor's radiance had changed shape. The Ecclesiarchy called it a miracle. The Inquisition called it contamination. None were entirely wrong. Inquisitor Arctellon's ship, now rechristened Silent Credence, drifted through the fringe of that golden cloud. The vessel's machine spirit hummed with unstable reverence, its systems occasionally lighting of their own accord, as though listening for something. Arctellon stood alone in the observation sanctum, a place of cracked marble and shattered icons. The Aquila above the viewport had been scorched black, but he had not restored it. Instead, he left it as it was, a scar that reminded him that faith was never unburned. He no longer prayed. There seemed little point in reciting words that had been consumed by their own certainty. Yet he still spoke to the silence. "If you can hear me," he murmured, "then tell me what you've become." The words vanished into the dark, but the faintest shimmer rippled across the glass, as if something vast and listening had heard. The last surviving astropath aboard the Credence had been blind long before the bombardment, but now she saw more than any mortal should. She sat chained to her throne of gold wire, her mouth moving soundlessly as she interpreted signals that were not signals, light that was not light. Her skin glowed faintly from within, veins tracing delicate patterns of gold beneath the surface. When Arctellin entered her chamber, she did not look up. She was staring through him, through the walls, through the void itself. "They are moving," she whispered. "Who?" "The Lightborne. The fragments. They speak to one another." Arctellin stepped closer. "What do they say?" She smiled, and it was a sorrowful thing. "They don't say. They remember. Each one carries a thought, a person, a prayer, a death. Together they are dreaming." He felt the skin along his arms tighten. "Dreaming of what?" She tilted her head as if listening to an unseen choir. "Of a new dawn." Her eyes rolled back and she screamed, not in pain but in ecstasy. Her body arched, light spilling from her mouth in silent song. The chamber vibrated, the bulkheads groaning. Arctellin reached for her, but the light burned too bright to approach. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The astropath slumped forward, her face serene, her body cold. Outside in the void, the golden fragments began to move faster, drawn toward a single point far beyond the system's reach. The coordinates were meaningless, a void between stars where nothing had ever existed. Yet the fragments streamed toward it in perfect unison, as if answering a summons no mortal could perceive. Arctellin returned to the bridge. The surviving crew watched him in uneasy silence. They were few now, stripped of faith and certainty, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He could feel their fear thick in the air, the dread of men who had seen their god's shadow and could no longer tell which side of it they stood upon. "Plot a course," he said. One officer hesitated. "To where, my lord?" He looked out into the starless expanse. "To where the light goes." The ship's engines stirred reluctantly to life. As the credence moved, the void around them seemed to shimmer. The warp veil thinned, not torn but parted, as though the light itself wished to be seen. Through it, Arctellin glimpsed shapes, vast, distant silhouettes moving with slow, terrible grace. They were not ships, not beings, not anything that could be measured. They were echoes made manifest, reflections of all who had burned on Ardentis and 1,000 worlds before it. They drifted like titans sculpted from the memories of faith. A thought pressed gently against his mind, not invasive, but familiar. "You followed fire once," it said. "Now follow silence." He clenched his fists. "If this is heresy, then name it. If this is redemption, then show it." But there was no answer, only the sense of something immense smiling without mouth or face. The void rippled, and the stars around them began to dim further, as if retreating from the presence of what approached. Hours, perhaps days, passed before the credence reached the center of the golden cloud. Here the fragments converged, merging into one vast sphere of light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was beautiful in its simplicity. No machinery, no structure, no throne, only illumination suspended in the void. Arctellin stepped to the viewport, his breath fogging the glass. "Is this what you wanted?" he whispered. "For faith to outlive its believers?" The sphere brightened, answering without sound. Within its core, shadows moved, human forms, countless and indistinct, rising and falling as if breathing. He thought he saw faces there, familiar ones. The crew he had lost, the priests he had condemned, even the woman who had once called him brother before he'd ordered her death. All of them woven into light, bound together by something greater than forgiveness. The sphere pulsed once, sending a ripple through the void that made every sensor aboard the credence flare white. The vox exploded with static that, when filtered through dying systems, sounded like laughter or weeping. The officer at the console turned to Arctellin, his voice shaking. "My lord, it's spreading. It's moving toward the Astronomican." Arctellin's heart stilled. Toward Terra, and then he understood. The Emperor's light was not being challenged. It was being joined. He sank to one knee, his head bowed. So this is how faith endures. The golden sphere flared again, its light folding inward, collapsing into a single thread of brilliance that streaked across the void toward the cradle of mankind. Arctellin rose slowly, his reflection flickering in the viewport, golden eyes, a faint smile not entirely his own. The last light of mankind had begun its return home. The Astronomican shuddered long before the light arrived. Deep within the palace of Terra, beneath the endless shrines and catacombs, beneath the rusting conduits that fed the Emperor's throne, the psychic beacon that had burned for 10,000 years began to falter. The choir of bound psychers screamed as one, their voices rising in pitch until their chains trembled. Custodians sealed the sanctum doors while tech priests prayed over their trembling machines. None knew what approached, only that the void itself was stirring, as if the universe were drawing breath before speaking for the first time in an age. Far above, in the orbiting bastions of the Imperial Navy, the storm became visible. What had once been a distant shimmer was now a vast column of light, threading through the warp and reality alike, moving faster than calculation, guided by no hand that could be charted. It carved its way through the immaterial currents like a needle through silk, leaving behind trails of gold that slowly bled into nothingness. Ships turned their augers toward it, and crews fell to their knees in awe or terror as it passed. For some it was the Emperor returning. For others it was proof that he had never left. Artellan's ship was the last to follow. The silent credence drifted on the wake of the golden current, its engines nearly dead, its hull blistered from exposure to energies no man could name. Within the shattered bridge, the Inquisitor stood at the viewport, watching as the light ahead grew larger, brighter, impossibly near. He could feel its rhythm in his pulse, its whisper in his breath. It was no longer outside him. It was within. He thought of the billions who had burned on Ardentis, their prayers, their terror, their final wordless longing for meaning. That yearning had not perished. It had become this, humanity's collective cry for purpose refined through flame, given shape through loss. He wondered if the Emperor had planned it, or if even gods could be surprised by what mortals became in their shadow. As the ship entered the upper atmosphere of Terra, alarms shrieked. The void shields flared, painting the sky with auroras of gold and white. The custodians stationed on the palace walls turned their halberds toward the heavens, their voices raised in warning and devotion. The Mechanicus networked through the palace screamed data psalms, each voice attempting to measure the immeasurable. Then the light descended. It came not as fire, but as silence. Every weapon, every lumen, every machine fell still. The golden current reached the throne, piercing the palace dome like a blade through silk, spilling radiance into the sanctum where the Emperor sat immobile upon his seat of agony. The custodians fell to their knees, not from fear, but from something older, a recognition buried deep within the soul of mankind. The throne did not resist. The conduits that bound him began to hum with new resonance, each one vibrating in time with the distant pulse of that long-dead world. The corpse that ruled mankind did not stir, yet the air thickened with presence. The silence was absolute. Then, like a breath drawn after eons, the light folded inward and vanished into the heart of the machine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Astronomican flared. Every psyker across the Imperium felt it. Every navigator saw it. The beacon that had once burned with the cold precision of duty now pulsed like a heartbeat, not constant but alive. The choir masters wept openly as the pressure on their minds eased for the first time in living memory. The light was still blinding, still absolute, but it no longer screamed. It sang. On the bridge of the silent credence, Artellan fell to his knees. The voice that filled his mind was neither command nor revelation. It was understanding. You called me faith. You made me fire. But I am neither. I am what endures when both fail. He bowed his head, tears cutting through the soot on his face. Then what are we? The shadow that teaches the flame how to burn. He looked up, and through the viewport he saw the world below transformed. Terra gleamed beneath the spreading auroras of the reborn beacon, its clouds gilded, its oceans catching the reflection of a light not from any sun. Across the hives, the people fell to the ground, uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. Statues cracked and bowed as if humbled. Bells that had not rung in centuries began to toll on their own, one after another, until the sound swept across the planet like the beating of wings. The Inquisition would call it heresy. The ecclesiarchy would call it prophecy, but Artellan understood it as something far simpler, a reckoning. Faith had survived its own execution. The child of Ardentis lived in him still, in every human who looked to the stars and saw not gods, but the reflection of what they might become. He could feel it, that faint collective whisper threading through the warp. It was not worship. It was will. The same force that had built empires and burned worlds now turned inward, shaping itself. He turned to his dying ship, to the hollowed remnants of his crew, and whispered a single vow. We will not forget what was born in fire. Outside, the light of the Astronomican steadied. The warp quieted around it as though even madness needed to pause before this new truth. Somewhere deep within the palace, the Emperor's eyes, those withered, empty sockets long thought blind, flickered with a faint trace of gold, and in that flicker, in that single impossible moment, a thought passed through every mind attuned to his will. Whether by faith or fear, the golden throne had not been repaired. It had been answered. Arctellon smiled through tears he did not remember shedding. For the first time in his life he felt small, not in despair but in awe. Humanity's God had not spoken. Humanity itself had. He looked to the stars beyond the window, now alive with the glow of the renewed beacon. It was no longer the light of a distant throne. It was the light of all who had burned and still believed. The last light of mankind was not divine. It was human, and it would never go out again.